Why should scarecrows win awards? Because they're outstanding in their fields. What would bears be without bees? Ears. Why can't your nose be 12 inches long? Because then it would be a foot. Okay, I'll stop. Obviously, I won't be quitting my day job anytime soon to go into comedy, but dad jokes aside, you've likely noticed that the people that tend to make us laugh often have the gift of combining multiple meanings together to catch us off guard. Hence the terms setup and punchline being used to describe the sequence of delivery used by most comics. As a Journal of Ethics article titled "The Science of Comedy" put it, humor results when we discover that the word initially appears incongruent in the context in which we first encounter it, has another meaning that makes logical sense when a different context is revealed. The use of multiple meanings may be quite harmless when used in a comedic sense, but can be quite harmful when used inappropriately in communicating important information to someone. And one such type of use is that of equivocation. To equivocate implies using words having more than one sense, so as to seem to say one thing but intend another. And people that argue this way often do so for a specific reason, as in a Mott and Bailey fallacy. Equivocation can also be used to conflate two positions, which share similarities, one modest and easy to defend, and one much more controversial. The arguer advances the controversial position, but when challenged, they insist that they're only advancing the more modest position. And such is often the case when evolutionists argue for their naturalistic view of origins, the story of evolution. And why do I say that? Well, generally the term evolution is used in two different senses, macro and micro, and the distinction between them is important to understand. Now, at Answers in Genesis, we don't generally use the terms macro and micro evolution to describe these concepts, as we find it often confuses people into thinking we perhaps believe part of the story of evolution, but not others. However, these terms are out there, so I'll explain how and why they're used just for the sake of argument, and to demonstrate why it can be so confusing for people. Now, on one hand, the word evolution is used to confer the general theory of evolution, the big picture idea that all life has descended from an original primitive organism that itself came from an inorganic form. It's typified by Darwin's tree of life diagram, where from a single stem at the bottom, all the branching depictions of various life forms are generated and depicted coming from it. It represents the concept that every creature that has ever lived came into being through small steps from simple to complex over millions of years, as one kind of creature gradually changed into others. Obviously, if protozoa or whatever the supposed first living thing was, didn't have things like bones, muscles, wings, blood clotting systems, eyes, sonar, etc., and all the intricate and amazing features we see in various creatures today do, then all of these brand new creatures and features must have developed slowly over time. This use of the term evolution posits that large changes in creatures must have occurred, such as the acquisition of new forms, functions, and features that never before existed, so as to facilitate the emergence of new creatures. At one time there were no fish, then fish evolved, but there were no amphibians. Then amphibians evolved, but there were no mammals, etc. This story of origins supposed to have occurred purely naturalistically, with no mind behind it. And this is generally what people think of when discussing pond scum to people evolution. And again, for the sake of argument, except for the life coming from non-life aspect, which we'll ignore for now, we'll refer to this concept of evolution as it's commonly called, macro or big evolution. Now, the second way in which you'll often see the word evolution used is to simply describe changes in living things. Evolution is change, you'll often hear. In this use of the term, genetic changes seen in various creatures' populations over time is deemed as something evolving. Now, various types of changes in creatures can be readily observed and can occur in response to environmental changes, or artificial or natural selection, or sometimes through random processes like genetic drift or mutations. Some are even inbuilt programming, such as those brought about through epigenetics. So basically, in this sense of the word, almost any kind of change, such as bird beak lengths, dominant colors in moths, or bacteria gaining resistance to drugs, is considered an example of evolution. And of course, this smaller version of evolution is commonly referred to as microevolution. Now, the big idea of macroevolution is simply a story or inference at best. It's not observable whatsoever. No one has ever observed one kind of creature turning into another, and this is admitted by evolution-believing scientists of all stripes.
We are condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow, too small a time scale to see evolution going on.
Now, admittedly, what's been deemed as microevolution has been observed. However, there are massive distinctions between the two versions of evolution we described, and they are most oftentimes ignored by those in the evolutionary community. Many often claim macroevolution is a fact, but then only offer examples after examples of microevolution as supposed proof for it, as if the substantiation of one is equal to the other. But this is fallacious on several levels. Firstly, changes in living things brought about by mechanisms like natural or artificial selection can't be deemed as macroevolution in the sense of bringing about new features or creatures that never existed before, because they only result in a recombination of genetic information that was already in existence prior to selection occurring. All selection processes must select from what was already there. Selection is not a creative process, which is what evolution would need to demonstrate. For example, if you start with light and dark-colored moths, and then light-colored moths get selected out of their environment, i.e. eaten by predators, because they're highlighted against darker backgrounds brought about by pollution, so to favor the dark-colored moths, that isn't evolution. And this has been admitted by the scientific community. For example, famous evolutionary biologist L. Harrison Matthews, writing the foreword to the 1971 edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, said this about the peppered moth: "The experiments beautifully demonstrate natural selection, or survival of the fittest, in action, but they do not show evolution in progress. For however the populations may alter in their content of light, intermediate, or dark forms, all the moths remain, from beginning to end, Biston bitularia." In the same vein of argumentation, evolutionists will often tout insects' evolving resistance to pesticides as proof of evolution. However, in every case studied, what's happening is simply culling insects that don't already have the resistance required against whatever substance is being used against them, and leaving behind the ones that do already possess it. These already resistant types then reproduce and pass that resistance on to subsequent generations. So, despite some evolutionists crowing over this evolutionary adaptation occurring through an acquisition of a newfound ability, resistance, all it demonstrates is another example of natural selection from what was already there. And evolution-believing scientists have admitted this is the case as well. Every time chemicals are sprayed on a lawn to kill weeds or ants, for example, a few naturally resistant members, i.e. they already have resistance, of the targeted population survive and create a new generation of pests that are poison resistant. So, even referring to these types of changes brought about in living things as microevolution is a misnomer, because they aren't evolving anything in any sense whatsoever. There's nothing new. As a matter of fact, after Darwin proposed his story of evolution, evolutionists quickly realized that natural selection could only select from whatever variable traits creatures already possessed, and therefore needed something more for their story to be viable. And that's why what students study today is called Neo-Darwinian theory, New Darwinism, which includes the reality of genetic mutations as the supposed creative mechanism needed. This news story states that mutations somehow generate the massive amount of new biological variation in DNA to account for the development of brand new kinds of forms and features for new creatures, which natural selection then sorts out accordingly. But what do we actually observe mutations doing? Evolutionists will often say that even though beneficial mutations are rare, they have been observed, and so belief in macroevolution is well substantiated. But purely beneficial mutations, in the sense that evolutionists need that to mean, have never been observed happening. And if evolution were true, they would have had to happen billions upon billions of times. Now, just to be clear, beneficial outcomes for creatures within specific environments due to genetic mutations have been observed. And this is where the old switcheroo in terms often confuses people into believing evolution has been verified scientifically. For example, if certain beetles spawn from a group living on a small windy island containing no insect predators, have a genetic defect that stunts the growth of their wings, that particular batch may have an increased survival rate compared to the regularly winged beetles, as they tend not to be blown into the sea by occasional high gusts of wind. Having no wings in this case would be a benefit in this specific environment, so much so that they may eventually become the dominant species in that area. However, if you're a beetle living elsewhere where predators abound, and you develop a genetic defect that messes up your ability to fly, you get selected out of the population pretty quickly. So for all of the shouts of an observed beneficial mutation that might come from the evolutionary community, all we have is another example of a creature that used to have something, wings, that no longer does. That's the opposite of what evolution needs to show in any sense of the word. Once again, there's nothing new. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll take on some of the evolution-believing community's most powerful examples of so-called beneficial mutations, and show why, in the big picture sense of what the story of evolution needs to demonstrate, they simply don't exist.